There is a moment in the life of a lion that almost no one ever sees, and it is not the kill, and it is not the roar, and it is not the dramatic charge across open grassland that ends up in nature documentaries. It is quieter than that. It is more brutal than that. It happens at the edge of the pride's territory, in the early morning when the light is still low and golden, and it involves a young male who was just a cub not long ago, who grew up inside the pride, who knows every member of the group by scent and sound, who has never known a morning without his family around him. And in this moment the adult males of the pride, often his own father or his uncles, turn on him, not to injure him seriously, not to kill him, but to make something absolutely clear: you are no longer welcome here, you will leave, and if you do not leave, we will make you leave. This is called eviction. It happens in almost every lion pride on the African savanna. It is as regular and predictable as the rain. And yet the weight of it, if you actually stop and think about what it means from the perspective of the young lion it is happening to, is extraordinary. One morning you are part of something. The next morning you are alone in a world that does not care about you at all. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the wild world the way it actually works, not the sanitized version, not the version that skips the hard parts, but the real thing, the deep thing, the version that will change how you see every nature documentary you watch for the rest of your life. Let us go. The lion we are going to follow in this story was born in what wildlife researchers working in the region would later describe as an unremarkable litter: two males and one female, born to a young mother in her second year of breeding, in one of the great lion strongholds of sub-Saharan Africa. He was unremarkable in the way that most newborn lions are unremarkable, which is to say he was small and spotted, and had enormous paws relative to his body, and spent most of his first weeks of life pressing himself against his mother's belly, and making the small, insistent sounds of an animal whose entire universe consists of warmth and milk, and the smell of the one being in the world it trusts completely. We are going to call him Nkosi. It is a word that means king in several Nguni languages of southern Africa, and it is a name that was given to him not at birth but much later, when the story of what he became began to circulate among the researchers and guides and observers who had watched his entire journey. At birth he was nothing. At birth he was just another mouth in a pride that already had plenty of mouths. At birth the odds were not particularly in his favor, because the odds are never particularly in favor of any individual lion born into the complexity and violence of pride life. Lion society is, when you look at it closely, one of the most sophisticated and also one of the most ruthless social structures in the entire animal kingdom. A pride is not a family in the way we use that word. Or rather, it is a family, but it is a family organized around a set of rules so strict and so enforced that the word family barely covers it. The females form the permanent core. They are sisters and mothers and aunts and daughters related to each other, committed to the same territory, the same hunting grounds, the same water holes and koppies and shade trees. They raise each other's cubs communally. They hunt together. They defend the territory together against other females from neighboring prides. Their loyalty to the group is absolute and lifelong. The males are different. The males are temporary. Even the males who currently dominate a pride, who father the cubs, who roar from the ridgelands in the early morning to announce their presence to the world, even they know on some deep level that their time is borrowed. Another coalition of males will come eventually. Younger, stronger, hungrier males who have been wandering as nomads and are looking for a pride to take over. When they come, the resident males will fight, and if they lose, which most eventually do, they will be driven out or killed. And the new males will kill the cubs, not out of malice, out of evolutionary logic. Kill the cubs of the previous males and the females come into estrus sooner. Sooner estrus means the new males can father their own cubs sooner. Every act of infanticide in a lion pride is a cold calculation written in the DNA of the species over millions of years of selection pressure. Nkosi was born into this. He did not know it, of course, in the way that we know things, but his body knew it. His instincts knew it. And the pride around him, in the way of all social animals, was already unconsciously sorting him, assessing him, making the thousand small calculations that would determine how he was treated, how much food he got access to, how much tolerance he received from the adult males who dominated the group. His first year was marked by the things that mark all lion cubs in their first year. The play, which is not only play but training, the wrestling and chasing and pouncing that builds the muscle and the reflex and the coordination that an adult lion will need to survive. The close observation of adults, sitting near a kill and watching how the experienced hunters position themselves, watching how the pride responds to danger, watching the complex social signaling that governs who eats first and who defers and who challenges and who retreats. The early learning before any formal instruction, because lions do not formally instruct their young, purely by proximity and observation and imitation. His mother was an attentive female, though attentiveness in lions is not the same thing as attentiveness in the human parenting sense. She did not teach him. She was not patient with his mistakes in the way a human parent might be patient. But she was present, she kept him close. She groomed him with the rough efficiency of a lion mother, which is a kind of communication in itself, a physical registration of belonging, of recognized membership in the group. When he was frightened, and young lions are frightened often, because the savannah is full of things that can kill a young lion and most of them are not shy about it, she was there. Her size and her smell and the rumble she made in her chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a purr were the coordinates around which his world was organized. His brother was larger than him almost from the beginning. This is worth noting because it became relevant later. The dynamics between sibling cubs are not innocent. There is competition for milk, competition for access to kills, competition for the attention and protection of the mother. The larger cub almost always has an advantage, and in a species where physical size is eventually one of the most important determinants of survival and reproductive success, that early advantage compounds. Nkosi's brother was always slightly ahead of him, slightly bigger, slightly more confident. It was a small difference at first, a small difference that the savannah had a way of making very large over time. The pride that Nkosi grew up in was dominated by two males, a coalition that had held control for about 2.5 years when he was born. This is a relevant detail because a coalition of two males holding a pride for 2.5 years is already on the far side of average. Most male coalitions hold a pride for 2 to 3 years before being displaced. These two males had been successful, which meant they were strong and experienced and knew how to cooperate. It also meant they were aging. By the time Nkosi was 18 months old and beginning to show the first signs of the mane that would eventually define him, the coalition that held his pride was 4.5 years into their tenure. The clock, though none of them could hear it, was running down. Nkosi's first serious encounter with the brutality of the savannah happened when he was about 14 months old, during a period of drought that compressed the prey animals around the dwindling waterholes and created a pressure on the pride's resources that sharpened every tension within the group. A large bull buffalo, confused and weakened by the drought, wandered into territory the pride used regularly, and the hunting females made the decision that most experienced lionesses eventually make about buffalo, which is that this one looks manageable, and moved to take it down. Buffalo are not prey animals in the way that impalas and wildebeest are prey animals. Buffalo fight back. Buffalo do not simply run and hope. They turn, they charge, they use their horns in ways that can and regularly do kill lions. A full-grown buffalo bull is one of the most dangerous animals on the African continent, not because it wants to kill things, but because it is perfectly designed to kill things that try to kill it. The hunting lionesses knew this and moved accordingly, coordinating with the fluid, largely silent communication of experienced hunters who have done this together many times before. What they could not fully account for was the young male. Nkosi, 14 months old, curious and excited by the tension of the hunt in a way that his good sense could not yet fully override, moved too close. The buffalo registered him before the experienced hunters had completed their positioning. It charged, not at the experienced females who were already moving to avoid it with the precise footwork of experience. At the young male who was not, Nkosi was hit. Not full on, not the full weight of an adult buffalo traveling at speed, which would simply have killed him, but a glancing blow from the horn that sent him tumbling and left him with a deep gash along his right flank that he would carry as a scar for the rest of his life. He survived, barely in the sense that the blow was close enough to something vital that a different angle would have ended the story here. But he survived, and the scar he carried from that day was not just a physical mark but a piece of information. Information that was processed unconsciously but thoroughly in the months that followed. Information about distance and timing, and the gap between the desire to be part of something and the capability to actually participate in it safely. He learned, in other words, not from instruction but from the most effective teacher in the natural world, which is pain followed by survival. By the time Nkosi was 2 years old, several things had changed in the pride simultaneously. His own body was changing, the mane coming in now not as a suggestion but as a real presence, sparse and dark at the edges of his face, thickening slowly across his neck and chest. His size was increasing rapidly, the explosive growth phase of a young male lion that adds muscle and bone in a way that can be almost visibly tracked month to month. And the social dynamics of the pride were shifting in ways that he could feel before he could fully process, in the way that young animals always sense the changing weather of their social world before they understand what it means. The two coalition males who had held the pride for going on 4 years now were being tested. Not yet displaced, but tested, which in lion society means that other males are appearing at the edges of the territory, moving closer than they once did, being less deterred by the roaring that defines and defends the boundary. The resident males were roaring more frequently, patrolling more aggressively, the physiological expression of animals who are aware, at some level of awareness that is not conscious thought but is nonetheless real, that their position is under threat. The pride was tense with it. Every animal in the group was responding to the underlying current of instability, the way every animal in a forest responds to the presence of a predator it has not yet located. What came next was not a dramatic battle. The displacement of lion coalitions is sometimes dramatic and sometimes not, and the details of what happened in this case were pieced together by researchers from tracks and blood signs and the sudden appearance of two unfamiliar large males in the territory and the equally sudden disappearance of the two residents. There was a fight. The residents lost. Whether they survived is not known with certainty, though one set of tracks suggested at least one of them moved north and east toward territory where a smaller, less defended pride was known to exist. Lions that are driven out do not always die immediately. Sometimes they find somewhere else. Sometimes they find a smaller pride to displace. Sometimes they live out their remaining years in a kind of reduced dignity that is not the life they had but is still a life. The new males who arrived in the pride were large. Researchers who observed them in the weeks following the takeover estimated both of them at close to maximum size for the species, well over 180 kilograms, with full dark manes that indicated they were in their physical prime, probably 5 to 7 years old. They were not from any pride that researchers in the area had been monitoring, which meant they had come from some distance, nomads who had been wandering and waiting for an opportunity of exactly this kind. They killed the cubs. This is the part of the story that is hardest to process in human emotional terms and most important to understand in scientific terms. They killed the cubs because that is what new males do. Every cub that had been fathered by the previous coalition was killed in the days following the takeover. Nkosi's youngest sibling, a female cub barely 5 months old, was among them. His mother fought to protect her. Lionesses always fight to protect their cubs. They almost never succeed against two prime males working together, and she did not succeed here. But Nkosi was not a cub anymore. He was 2 years old, and 2-year-old males occupy a specific and uncomfortable position in this calculus. They are not young enough to be killed without significant risk to the attacking males. A 2-year-old lion already approaching full size can fight back in a way that costs something, but they are also not welcome to stay. They are not the cubs of the new males. They eat the new males' food. They compete with the new males' eventual sons. And most critically, they will within a year or two be mature enough to challenge the males who have just taken over, which is precisely what the new males do not want living in their pride. So the new males drove them out. Nkosi and his brother, the two young males who had been born into this pride 2 years earlier and had known no other home, were harassed and chased and bitten and made to understand in the unambiguous language of teeth and size and force that they no longer had a place here. The lionesses who had raised them, including their own mother, did not intervene, could not intervene. We're already adjusting to the new social reality of the pride in the way that all female lions adjust to every takeover that occurs during their lifetimes, because they are the constants and the males are the variables, and the females who survive long enough to see multiple takeovers do so by adapting. Nkosi left. He was not killed. He was not seriously injured in the eviction itself. He was driven to the edge of the pride's territory and then beyond it into the no man's land between territories where young males go when they have nowhere else to be. He and his brother left together, which was the best possible outcome of a bad situation, because a coalition of two is immeasurably better than a solo nomadic life, and two young males together can keep each other alive through the years ahead in ways that one alone cannot. That was the beginning of 5 years that researchers would later look back on and try to piece together from tracks and sightings, and the occasional camera trap image and the reports of guides who spotted them from safari vehicles in areas far from where they had been born. The story of those 5 years is the story that matters, because what happened to Nkosi in those 5 years is not a story about luck, though luck played a role. It is a story about what an animal becomes when the only thing it has to rely on is itself. The first months of nomadic life are the most dangerous. This is statistically established and physiologically obvious. Young male lions moving through territories that are controlled by established coalitions are in constant danger of being killed by the resident males, who regard them exactly as they should be regarded, as future competition, and act accordingly. The nomads must move through these territories carefully, staying away from the core areas where the pride sleeps in the males' patrol, slipping through the edges like water finding the gaps in rock. They must hunt for themselves now, which is different from what they grew up doing, because the lionesses of the pride did most of the hunting and the males primarily appropriated the results, and young males who have not yet had to feed themselves are not accomplished hunters. Nkosi and his brother hunted badly at first. This is not a criticism, it is a physical reality. Hunting a large prey animal successfully requires a level of coordination and experience that takes time to develop, and the errors young nomadic lions make in the early months of independence are costly in calories burned chasing animals they do not catch, and in the risk of injury every failed hunt represents. They ate what they could catch, which in those first months was smaller and more accessible prey, birds and reptiles and small mammals that provided barely enough energy to support the bodies of two large growing males. They stole kills when they could, which was not often because hyenas and other lions defended their kills aggressively. There was a period, researchers estimate it lasted several months in the late dry season of Nkosi's second year of nomadic life, when both brothers were visibly thin. Camera trap images from that period, which researchers identified only later when they were trying to reconstruct the timeline, show two young males with their ribs showing and their hip bones prominent and the dull coat of animals who are not getting enough nutrition. This is the period when many young nomadic males die, not dramatically, not in some great battle, they simply cannot sustain themselves. The savanna is not generous with its resources, and the hierarchy of access to those resources does not favor young males without a territory and without allies. But they survived it, partly because they had each other. A pair of lions, even young ones, can hold a kill against competitors that a single lion cannot. A pair can attempt larger prey than a solo hunter should risk. A pair provides the basic social warmth and security that social animals need at a biological level, the kind that cannot be replaced by food alone. They survived the thin months, and in surviving them they became something that only surviving hard things can make you. They became lean in the functional sense, the excess of easy pride life stripped away. The necessity of figuring things out for themselves, carving new neural pathways, new behavioral flexibility, new responses to situations that no one had prepared them for. By the time Nkosi was 3 years old, his mane had come in properly. This is worth dwelling on because the mane of a male lion is not primarily a weapon or an armor, though it provides some protection to the neck during fights. It is primarily a signal, a complex, multidimensional signal that communicates age and health and testosterone levels and genetic quality to every other lion that sees it. The darkness of the mane matters. Darker manes signal higher testosterone. The fullness of the mane matters. A thin, patchy mane speaks of stress and poor nutrition in ways that any lion reading it instinctively understands. The spread of the mane matters, whether it covers the chest and shoulders and flows back toward the flanks, indicating full maturity and good condition. Nkosi's mane, as it grew in, was dark. Not as dark as the darkest manes researchers have documented, but substantially darker than average, and it framed his face in a way that changed his appearance from that of an adolescent to that of something more serious. His size had continued to develop through the nomadic period, and despite the months of inadequate nutrition, he had come through the worst of it and was now growing into what he was going to be physically. He was large. Not the largest lion ever documented in this ecosystem, but significantly above average, with the particular structure of a lion that carries most of its mass in its shoulders and chest, which is what you want in a fighter. His brother was also large, but there was a difference now, subtle but real, in how they moved and how they carried themselves that observers who knew them both could register. The brother moved with confidence. Nkosi moved with something beyond confidence. He moved with an awareness. A kind of reading of the environment that was continuously active, continuously processing, that manifested as a quietness that was not timidity but was the opposite of timidity. The quietness of an animal that does not need to announce itself because it is completely comfortable with what it is. They found their first real territorial holding at around 3.5 years, when they moved through a boundary area between two established pride territories and discovered a gap, a stretch of land that was being minimally defended by an older coalition of males on one side and not yet claimed by any coalition on the other side. It was not prime territory. It was not the lush, prey-rich riverine habitat that the best territories offer. It was a transitional zone, drier with sparser prey, the kind of territory that younger or weaker coalitions end up with because the better places are already taken. But it was theirs, or at least no one immediately and forcefully disputed it. They marked it, they roared from its boundaries. They patrolled its perimeters with the specific intensity of animals who have something to lose for the first time, which is a different intensity from the general alertness of the nomad who has nothing to protect and therefore is always ready to move. The roaring of territorial males carries differently from the roaring of nomads. It is more grounded, more consistent. It comes from the same places night after night in the way that a home is the same place night after night, invested with the meaning of habitual presence. No females came immediately. Females do not simply move to where males are holding territory. The relationship between males and prides of females is complex and mediated by the female's own territorial traditions, by the existing social bonds within female groups, by the presence of cubs and the stage of their development. What young males establishing themselves in a new territory actually wait for, in the ecological sense, is the arrival of females who are either newly independent from their own birth prides or whose existing situation has been disrupted enough that they are willing to consider a new affiliation. It takes time. In that time, something was happening in Nkosi that is difficult to describe in purely biological terms, though it is not incompatible with biology. He was developing what experienced wildlife researchers and guides sometimes call presence. It is one of those words that can sound mystical but is actually quite concrete. Presence in a large predator is the aggregate of physical signals, posture, movement, gaze, sound, scent, that communicate to every other animal in the environment that this individual is something to be accounted for. Every lion has some degree of presence. A few lions, the ones that stop your vehicle at 200 meters and make the hairs on your arms stand up before you have consciously registered what you are looking at, have it in a measure that seems almost unfair. The years of nomadic life had built something in him. The deprivation and the problem-solving and the necessity of figuring out every situation without a template had built something. He was not the same animal he would have been if he had grown up in a pride and been handed territory by circumstance. He was something that had been forged by necessity into a particular shape, and the shape was formidable. A set of females, a small group of 3 related lionesses whose association with their original pride had been disrupted by the death of several group members during a disease outbreak, found the territory Nkosi and his brother were holding and spent several weeks at the margins of it evaluating. This evaluation is real and active and specific. Female lions do not simply accept the males who happen to be present. They assess them. They watch how the males respond to stress. They watch how the males hunt or attempt to hunt. They watch how the males interact with each other. They watch how the males behave toward them, whether the males are aggressive or tolerant, whether the males seem like they are capable of defending a territory and keeping it safe for cubs. What the 3 lionesses saw over those weeks was 2 males who were established in their territory, who patrolled it consistently, who did not back down from the hyenas that regularly challenged them at kills, and who responded to the lionesses' gradual encroachment into the territory with tolerance that was clearly calibrated, not aggressive, not overly eager, simply tolerant in a way that communicated comfort with itself. They stayed. This is not courtship in the romantic sense. It is an ecological transaction conducted in the language of presence and behavior over weeks of cautious mutual assessment. But it was the beginning of something. The pride that formed around Nkosi and his brother over the following year was small by the standards of large lion prides. 3 females, eventually producing cubs from both males. But it was a pride. It was a social structure. It was a territory with defined boundaries that were known to the neighboring coalitions and respected, not always easily but respected. Nkosi was no longer a nomad. He was no longer the expelled cub moving through a world that had no place for him. He was a pride male. This is the moment in the story where many tellings would stop. The exile returns, the outcast finds his footing. The young lion who was driven out now has a pride of his own. It is a satisfying narrative endpoint and it is real and it matters. But it is not the end of Nkosi's story. Because what happened next is not something that most lions do and is the reason that his story was eventually noticed by the researchers who had been tracking this ecosystem for years. Most young male lions who establish a first territory do so and then hold it, defending what they have, maintaining the status quo of their first foothold in a world that had initially rejected them. This is the rational strategy. The territory they have cost them years of hardship to establish. The pride they have built cost them years of waiting. Pressing beyond it, attempting to expand, picking fights with established coalitions in better territories, is a risk calculation that most lions make conservatively. Nkosi did not make it conservatively. The territory immediately to the south of the area he and his brother held was one of the best in the ecosystem. Researchers who had been working in the area for nearly a decade called it the Southern Ground, and it contained everything that prime lion territory is supposed to contain. A permanent water source, a seasonal river that never fully dried even in the worst drought years, dense riverine vegetation along the river banks that provided shade and cover for stalking. Seasonal concentrations of buffalo and zebra and wildebeest that moved through on the ancient routes their ancestors had used for thousands of years. And a coalition of 3 males, an established trio who had held this territory for nearly 3 years, and who had under normal circumstances another year or two of dominance ahead of them before age and accumulated wear began to tip the balance. 3 against 2, and the 3 were in their prime, experienced, well-fed, in a territory that had sustained them through drought and disease and everything else the savanna throws at its inhabitants. Any rational assessment of the odds would say that this is not the time to push south. Wait, consolidate, let the 3 males age another 2 or 3 years until the gap closes. Nkosi began making incursions into the southern ground in his 4th year of nomadic and early territorial life. They were cautious at first, moving into the periphery of the territory, marking trees and rocks with scent in the subtle way that is more about information than about provocation, reading the responses. The 3 males noticed. Of course they noticed. They roared from deeper in their territory, reinforcing their presence, reminding anything within earshot that this place was claimed. But Nkosi came back, and each time he came back he pushed a little deeper. This is a kind of behavioral information gathering that is almost never described in nature documentaries because it is slow and undramatic and requires someone to be watching over many months to perceive the pattern. He was not simply challenging. He was learning. He was building a map, not a spatial map, though that too, but a social map of the 3 males in the territory, how fast they responded to his incursions. Which of the 3 responded most aggressively and which were more measured? How their responses changed depending on time of day, on whether they had fed recently, on how recently they had patrolled the specific section of boundary he was probing. His brother participated in some of these incursions and held back from others, and this variability was itself information. Information about the combined threat they presented and how the resident males calculated the risk. A coalition of 3 has a significant advantage over a coalition of 2 in a direct confrontation. But a coalition of 3 that must respond simultaneously to incursions in different parts of their territory faces a different calculation. 2 males moving together against a large territory with 3 defenders need to split those defenders or exhaust them or find the moment when the arithmetic of the situation shifts in their favor. The shift came, as these things often do, not from a dramatic confrontation but from the accumulation of small events that individually seemed manageable and collectively became untenable. One of the 3 resident males was injured during a buffalo hunt, a kick from a retreating bull that damaged his right foreleg in a way that did not prevent him from walking, but noticeably affected his speed and his fighting capability. He did not disappear from the territory. Injured lions do not simply remove themselves from the equation. But he was compromised, and in a world where every calculation of force and threat is continuously being made by every animal in the system, a compromised male in a coalition of 3 changes the effective arithmetic of that coalition. Nkosi pushed harder, not into the section of the territory where the injured male was most often found, which would have been the obvious aggressive move and also the one most likely to provoke a unified defensive response. Into the opposite section, drawing the 2 uninjured males away from the injured one, creating a geography of separation that was not natural to a coalition that had functioned as a unit for 3 years. Researchers piecing together this sequence later from camera trap images and GPS data from collared individuals and the field notes of guides who were in the area during this period described it in language that made several of them uncomfortable, because describing a lion's behavioral strategy in terms that imply planning and calculation runs into the constant friction between what we observe and what we are professionally comfortable attributing to non-human animals. But what the data showed was a pattern of behavior over several months that was spatially and temporally organized in a way that was not random and was not simply aggressive opportunism. It was something more deliberate than that. The confrontation that changed everything happened in the early hours of a morning in the dry season, when the waterholes were low, and the prey animals were concentrated, and the resident males were already stretched thin managing their core territory. Nkosi and his brother entered the southern ground not from the direction they had been probing most frequently, but from a different angle entirely, a route that brought them to the river before the resident males had time to respond to their scent. They had killed a young zebra at the river's edge and were feeding when the 2 uninjured resident males arrived. What happened next was witnessed from a distance by a researcher who was in the field that morning for entirely unrelated reasons, and who later described it in field notes that circulated among the community of scientists and conservationists working in the ecosystem. The 2 resident males approached the feeding pair. The normal course of events in a situation like this is that the intruders, outnumbered or at least matched, eventually yield the kill and retreat. They know the territory is not theirs. The resident males know they know it. The kill may be contested, but the territorial claim is not. But Nkosi did not retreat from the kill. He turned from it. He placed himself between the approaching males and his brother, who continued feeding, and he faced the residents with a stillness that the researcher described as unlike anything she had seen in years of fieldwork. She used the word composed, not aggressive, not submissive, composed, and the 2 resident males who had every numerical and residential advantage slowed. They stopped. They read the situation through all the channels available to them, scent and posture and eye contact, and the particular quality of the sound that was coming from the dark-maned male in front of them. A sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a growl, but something that carried in it a kind of certainty that the researcher said she felt in her chest from 50 meters away. The residents retreated, not ran. Lions do not run from situations like this unless they have been seriously frightened. They retreated, backing away and then moving parallel to the river before disappearing into the vegetation. The researcher sat in her vehicle and wrote in her notebook for 20 minutes before she drove back to camp. Over the following weeks, the balance shifted with a speed that surprised everyone who was watching. The injured male's condition did not improve, and a coalition of two that is functionally a coalition of two against a healthy coalition of two that is moving with purpose and increasing confidence is not the same as a coalition of three. By the time the rainy season arrived, Nkosi and his brother were spending as much time in the southern ground as in their original territory. The three resident males were moving north and east, away from the river. Away from the best hunting grounds, toward the marginal areas where displaced males end up. It was not a single battle. It was not a moment of cinematic violence. It was the slow, relentless pressure of two individuals who had been forged in the hardest possible conditions, bearing down on a situation that had seemed settled, and making it unsettled through sheer consistency of purpose, and a quality of presence that changed the calculation for every animal it touched. The three resident males eventually cleared the southern ground entirely. Researchers never confirmed a fatal confrontation. The residents simply yielded, the way established powers sometimes yield, not to defeat in a single engagement, but to the accumulated weight of someone who simply will not stop. The pride that Nkosi and his brother established in the southern ground in the years that followed became, over time, one of the largest and most stable lion social groups in that ecosystem. The three original lionesses came with them from the previous territory, having followed the males through the transition with the pragmatic loyalty of females who understand that their survival is tied to the quality of the males holding their territory. Other females joined over time, young lionesses from disrupted groups or from the periphery of neighboring prides who read the new structure of the landscape and made the obvious calculation. Cubs came, many cubs. This is one of the critical measures of a pride's success in evolutionary terms, not the size of the territory and not the beauty of the dominant male's mane and not the drama of any particular hunt or confrontation, but the cubs. How many cubs survive? How many cubs reach independence? How many of those cubs go on to reproduce? Nkosi's pride raised cubs at a rate that researchers in the ecosystem described as exceptional, an artifact of the quality of the territory, the water and the prey, the stability of the dominant coalition, the experience and effectiveness of the hunting females, and the ability of the territorial males to hold the boundaries against the constant pressure of other males looking for exactly what Nkosi had found. The story of those cubs is its own story, of course. Some of them will grow up and leave and wander and find their own territories. Some of the males will be driven out, as Nkosi was driven out, and they will go through years of hardship that will either kill them or forge them into something capable of surviving. And some of them, if the mathematics of the savannah works in their favor, will come back to a territory like this one, not this exact territory. The savannah is too large and too shifting for that kind of symmetry. But a territory like it, with water and prey and females and the fundamental dignity of belonging to a place that belongs to them. There is a particular morning, several years into Nkosi's time in the southern ground, that a guide working in the area described in a blog post that was shared widely enough to reach researchers who were working on understanding the long-term dynamics of lion populations in the ecosystem. The guide had taken a group of visitors to a lookout point above the river just before sunrise. One of those mornings when the light comes up slowly and turns the grass from gray to gold to a color that has no name because it only exists for about 40 seconds in the transition between night and day on the African savanna. Nkosi was sitting on a rock outcrop above the river below them. His brother was nearby but slightly lower on the slope. As was usual for them in those years, the hierarchy between them settled into something comfortable and implicit. The pride was distributed around the outcrop in the way of animals who have spent so many mornings in this place together that the arrangement is automatic. The females and the cubs of various ages in the shade of the rock face. The two males above, visible against the lightning sky. And then Nkosi roared, not at anything specific, not in response to a threat or a sound from outside the territory. Just into the morning, the way territorial males roar to announce themselves to the world, the declaration of presence that says I am here, this is mine, everything within the radius of this sound knows I exist. The roar of an adult male lion at full voice carries 5 kilometers, in the right atmospheric conditions further. It is one of the most powerful sounds produced by any land animal, and it affects every creature that hears it in ways that are measurable physiologically. Increases in heart rate, changes in hormonal profile, the ancient mammalian recognition of something that was at the top of the food chain before our ancestors came down from the trees. The guide described the visitors going completely silent, not the odd silence of people watching something beautiful, though it was that. The biological silence of mammals hearing something that their nervous systems, regardless of how many centuries of civilization lie between them and the savannah, still recognize. He described one of the visitors, a man in his 60s who had been on safari many times, quietly crying, not from sadness, just from the sudden, overwhelming reality of it. Nkosi roared for almost a minute. The sound rolled across the river and into the dawn and was answered distantly by his brother and then by nothing, because there was nothing in that territory that had a sound to answer it with. When he stopped, he sat for a moment longer on the rock, looking out over his territory with an expression that guides sometimes call surveying, and which may or may not mean anything in terms of inner states, but which from the outside looks, undeniably, like an animal that knows where it is and what it has. Then he stood, stretched in the full-body way of cats that involves every muscle from the tips of the forepaws to the end of the tail, and walked down to where the females were sleeping in the shade of the rock face and lay down among them and closed his eyes. There is so much that this story asks us to think about. Not in a forced, moralistic way, because the savannah does not deal in morals, it deals in consequences and adaptations and the slow statistical grinding of natural selection. But in the